Beloved children's author Andy Griffiths is a Deakin alum with a passion for humour and imagination. In this episode, we explore his journey from punk rocker and English teacher to world-renowned author, and how stories can spark joy, build literacy, and create lifelong connections between kids and adults. From the lands of the Wurundjeri people, this is Stories of Wonder. Andy Griffiths, welcome to Stories of Wonder.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's very good to have you. I think you're single-handedly going to be responsible for reducing the demographic age of our audience today, so thanks for that. Look, let's get started. You've had a very long and successful career writing for young people. Take us back to the start. What got you into writing children's literature?
You want to go right back to the start?
Yeah, let's go. Just give us a little smidge of the beginning.
Well, my first encounters with books at the age of 4 or 5 that I can remember were Dr. Seuss books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And immediately these were like a playground for me, and I wanted to sort of write my own responses to them because I knew how much pleasure I got from them, the places of appropriately wonder, stories of wonder.
Did we get that? We've got a grab there. Yeah, great.
Stories of wonder that, you know, would make me wonder and give me pleasure and slightly disturb me with certain things that I couldn't understand.
Yeah.
But that's good. And so I was immediately sort of, as soon as I could pick up a pen, writing and drawing little things.
Wow.
Number one, to amuse myself. Then I found I could get a rise out of my parents by writing something outlandish.
Mm-hmm. What's an example of something that you wrote that was outlandish when you were that young?
Oh, famously in the family law, I wrote a get well card for my dad. It said, "Dear Daddy, get well soon." And he turned the page and it said, "Oh, you are doomed." And showed him being buried in the backyard with an icy pole stick cross and you know, we did it right.
Yeah. And he appreciated that, obviously.
He's still alive, yeah. He's too scared to die.
And he's dead.
But I instinctively, I knew to do the opposite to what the reader expected from a very young age. And you could get laughter out of that. You could get shock. You could get shocked laughter. And that's what I used to do at school with my friends, was draw little cartoons, and we'd just be killing ourselves laughing down the back. And it's a very pure form of communication. So I was always writing in some form or another.
And it sounds like even from that age, you were very much writing for yourself.
Myself was very important. Yeah, there's no point writing something that I wasn't amused by or involved in some way. But the audience reaction was also very much part of that equation.
Yeah.
So, I was writing something, producing a joke magazine with fake news for my Year 7 cohort, typing it all up, running it off on a 40-graph machine, selling copies to the other students for 3 cents a copy.
Wow.
So that was in Year 7. And always it was a very natural thing for me to write. And then I discovered rock and roll, David Bowie, Alice Cooper, very much. And I saw them being creative with words and theatrically in both their cases. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do, be on a stage, spinning out this kind of terrible shock horror stories about nightmares and black widow spiders.
Yeah.
And so that's what I kind of did creatively once again.
Yeah.
All throughout school we had an imaginary rock band and I wrote all the lyrics, designed all the album covers.
Wow, you were so creative and entrepreneurial as well from a very early age.
But not entrepreneurial enough to actually learn an instrument or learn how to sing. It was all pure entertainment.
Yeah.
But we put on a joke performance on the last day of Year 12 for the school.
What do you mean by joke performance?
Well, none of us could barely play. I mean, the drummer could drum.
Yeah.
But Everyone else was just making noise with their instruments. I was yelling the lyrics tunelessly.
Mm-hmm.
But we, were a big success that day. It was sort of punk rock.
Yeah.
But I discovered, oh my goodness, I can entertain people. Like I like being up here with a microphone.
Yeah.
I pursued that for a number of years. By night, after leaving school, I was performing in alternative bands in Melbourne in a thriving underground scene.
And so while you were going to school?
Well, I was studying a honours degree in English literature at Monash University by day. Mm-hmm. And then at night it was all punk rock and all rehearsals. So, but I was using words and affecting people with the words.
And I think it sounds like from very early on you knew the effect that you wanted to have on people, but maybe you had a lot of different options there creatively as to how to kind of deliver that.
Yeah, and with the band it was all wild energy. It was this thrilling kind of chance to really go crazy sonically and physically on stage.
And so how do you get from that then to then becoming a teacher for a while?
Well, there was a period where the first band, Gothic Farmyard, achieved a certain notoriety on the scene, but that was after 3 or 4 years of really hard work. And then it all sort of broke up. And I began to sort of get the hint. I was like, I'm not that musical, but I'm not that musically gifted, but I do love the words. So I extracted myself from that scene, started taking learn to write courses, reading books on how to write better. And I was like, I can improve what I do. There's techniques. And so I took that raw kind of instinctual talent, started learning about it. At the same time, I did a dip ed at what was Rusden College, now Deakin. And I was in front of kids in high school who trying to teach them English. And they were like, books, that's so last century, as if anyone would ever pick up a book willingly. And I was like, you're making a big mistake there. Books are a lot of fun. So I started writing little punk rock stories for them. I wrote, what about the day my bum went psycho? And
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, wow, you can write about this stuff? I said, yes. Writing is an infinite playground for imagination. There are no limits. So by example, I was getting them to write, and I was self-publishing class books.
So you were kind of, so you were almost doing what you were doing
when I was in year 7.
I was for, a cohort of kids that you would teach.
Yeah, and they were having fun, I was having fun, and I was building up my own little collection of small, provocative, creative pieces. It might be how to annoy your parents, this is how you swing on the clothesline. And if you really want to annoy them, you break the clothesline and you all get on it. So I was instructing them how to be really annoying.
Did any of the kids try these tips or stories? Sorry.
Very rarely, although there was one in Just Annoying, my second book, which was how to fill the shower up with water by sealing it off with silicone glue. So it was just my character, my fictional character has license to explore any ill-advised sort of thing that he gets in his head.
Yeah.
And I knew from being a visiting writer in schools that kids loved this idea of filling up the shower cubicle with water. So I went, what if you had someone dumb enough to glue it all up? And then what's the worst thing that could happen? He can't turn the taps off. And so this story was an exploration of that. And kids really loved it because eventually he has to climb into the roof to get out of the stop himself from drowning. And then he falls through one of the rooms onto the dining table where his parents are having a dinner party. And I used to defend that story to people who were concerned that if you let kids read this type of material, the child won't have a well enough established boundaries to know what's real and what's not real, or what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And I would defend those kids to the death, I would say, no, they know the difference. That's why they want to read this story. That's why it's funny. They know this kid is working way out of the bounds of common sense and safety. And if they didn't, it wouldn't be funny. So I did, that was my case for about 10 years while I settled people down and said, it's okay to have stories where people don't do the right thing. Just like you adults love your murder mysteries, but you don't all go out murdering as a result of, oh, that seems like a good idea. My character always suffered the most whenever he did anything awful. So there was that, but they weren't trying to instruct. They were for the pure exhilaration of an imaginative journey.
Yeah, to almost experience what that would be like without having to do it.
Without having to do it.
And just checking no kids actually did.
I have met subsequently a handful of kids who said, I actually tried that. And my parents, and I flooded the bathroom and damaged the shower, and my parents made me pay it back with pocket money.
Well, that's why we brought you here today, Andy, because all those parents are here. Bring them in, guys. Well, that
was a handful of like maybe half a dozen. Well, there's 5 on a hand, isn't there? Maybe 5 kids out of millions. Who
well, that's good.
Books.
That's a good ratio, I think.
Yeah.
So how long were you a teacher for?
All up about 4 years.
Okay.
And all the while I was building up little self-published collections of my pieces that's on a photocopier and stapled together. And I was, giving them away, selling them in shops.
Right. And what was what were you finding? Were they selling well? Was there a good response to it? And what was the tipping point for you to be like, well, hold on, I think this might actually be, something that I should be doing as a more significant part of my life?
Over 2 or 3 years, a lot of people were going, this is great. I've thought about these things, but I thought it was just me,
Right.
And a writer is someone who comes out and says what they're honestly thinking.
Yeah.
And then everyone else goes, I was thinking that, but I thought I was weird,
Yeah.
I remember after one collection of stories, I had I'd written about a childhood fantasy because I loved whipped cream and strawberries. That was the ultimate dessert. And I used to think, what if you filled the entire kitchen with whipped cream and strawberries, and then you could just swim around in it, with your mouth open. It was just an idle fantasy. I was never going to do it, as if you could. But I wrote about this, and then I wrote, oh, gee, what happens after a while when you're sick of whipped cream and strawberries, or you need to go to the bathroom? Will you have to be swimming around in that as well? So heaven turns into hell. And it's like you take a little silly fantasy and you treat it really seriously, and people respond because it's both funny and weird, but it triggers things. Oh, yeah, I didn't have that one maybe, but I had this thought,
Yeah.
So that's what good writing is, I think. Once again, it's the equation. It's completed when you get a reaction. But I just thought, yeah, I would love to do this for my living. So I took leave without pay. I saved up my pay, half my pay. I just banked automatically, knowing I would probably do this one day. Came back to Melbourne, did a graduate diploma of fiction and a graduate diploma of editing at Deakin College in Toorak, and wrote 12 hours a day on my own time with my own little stock of money, which was not a lot, and just broke through to find what my voice was, which was not obvious to me. I thought, maybe I've got to learn to write properly now, proper stories, not this silly stuff. But the only stuff I was doing throughout that 2 years was it came alive when I just gave in to the silly voice and the comedic voice.
Well, that's so interesting. And I guess that probably happens to a lot of artists when you go to learn something at an institution as well. You feel like you can't possibly just be doing this already, but it just sounds like from this end, even as a kid, you had such an authentic voice and imagination that is so sort of, I don't know, it seems like it was formed very early.
Yeah, it was very early and it was very natural to me. So natural I couldn't even see that it was anything that everyone didn't have, you know.
Yeah.
And my teacher at Deakin was Carmel Bird, who was a wonderful teacher, is a wonderful teacher of writing. She always refused to tell me how to do anything. She just said, here's some principles of good writing, you know, take them or leave them. And by the end of the year, I went, right, I know roughly what what techniques are and what rules are. And I knew confidently then that I could break them if I needed to. Mm-hmm. And that's the essence of comedy, is breaking rules.
Yeah.
So I would write a story that was all build but no climax, and then just walk away and leave the reader hanging.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of artists and, you know, journalists that I know and actors that I know find a similar thing where it's a natural instinct that they already have, but it is that kind of classic thing of like, it's good to know the rules eventually so that you can at least be more deliberate with where you break them.
Exactly. Yeah. You can get a lot of comic effects out of breaking normal rules of storytelling.
And it sounds like you learnt a bit about editing as well.
Oh, absolutely. That was the other crucial part of that year and that course, was showing me how cheap words are, how you can just slash and burn and still have the meaning conveyed in 10% of the words that you thought were so brilliant.
It's probably a hard one for most writers to learn because you must at some point think a lot of your value is in.
As a beginning writer, you think everything that you write is deathless, wonderful prose. And it's quite a common thing that they see the editor as an enemy who's trying to simplify and, you know, turn the brilliance into just another sausage. And whereas I always, as a result of the course, saw the editor as trying to help you, trying to save you from yourself, because you can't. It's hard to get outside of yourself and see your writing objectively. But that's what editing teaches you. And you have to, there's two parts of writing, I think. There's the initial wild creation, the pleasure, the joy. That kid in the classroom is just writing for sheer hell of it. Mm-hmm. And you want that. But then if you're going to do anything further with the piece, you need to come back with a very cold, objective, clinical, and go, nah, that's not working. No, there's one good idea in here. Mm-hmm. I need to slash the whole piece, start again. And that's where the other part of being a writer is sheer dogged persistence, the willingness to rewrite over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Until you're getting a piece that will give you the effect that you're hoping in for the reader.
And a bit of resilience by the sounds of it as well.
Resilience, persistence, psychological insight. You know, if you do read a lot of self-help books, that's really helpful. So that you know when someone reacts to a story, they're not attacking you, they're attacking the story. And, they're reacting to the story. You've triggered something in them, which may or may not have anything to do with you. So you can get that distance from what you create so that when you get those bad reviews, which everyone does, it's not a crushing thing. It's, they didn't like it. Or I would look at a bad review and go, is there anything in this that is actually legitimate? You know, have they got a point? Yes, maybe they have. Maybe I am relying on the toilet humour just a bit too much and it's time to move on. And that can be a very valuable part of negative feedback. But there'll be other value judgments that person's making that are not really relevant to you.
Yeah. So you spent a year at this point studying. You've saved up a bit of money while you've been working, writing, editing at Deakin. What happens after the course is done? Do you know straight away, right, I'm ready to fully step into this? This is my new career, or is there, is it more complicated than that?
As a result of that, there was 2 years that I managed to save, and then spend the money that I'd saved. Then I went back to teach for a year. But I had connected with an educational publisher who said, I'd like to publish some of your provocative pieces as a creative writing textbook for teachers. And I was like, yeah, okay, it's not quite the trade paperback bestseller that I was hoping for, but it's something. I can learn something from this process. And her name was Rena Leuenberg, Longman, Cheshire, and I remember having a meeting, and she said, I'm going to get this guy, Terry Denton. He's a freelance illustrator, very funny. I think he'd be a good kind of good match for your humour.
Wow.
And she was so on the money there.
Fateful.
Absolutely. And that first book was called Swinging on the Clothesline, and it showed a bunch of kids in the backyard swinging off their clothesline towards the sky, and they were heading to outer space.
Wow, yeah.
And there was also a cow upside down and a crab.
He likes a cow, doesn't he, Terry?
He loves, right from the start. For no apparent reason, but there was the exhilaration and freedom of creative play in that image. And I started getting invitations while I was going to teach education conferences to promote my book. And I was inviting the teachers to play and to create little pocket books and to write labels for jars, because that was part of the thing I was doing, was writing that doesn't seem like writing. They loved it. They would invite me into their schools, and now I was starting to make a living as a creative writing teacher in schools, and there was another 4 years before I nailed down what became the first book, Just Tricking.
Wow.
And that was with Terry's help, because most of the publishers in Australia were very nervous, didn't quite understand what I was about, because this kind of crazy punk rock literature that didn't appear to have any moral purpose or teach anyone anything, that we don't know what to do with it. Basically, it's all very entertaining, but we can't see a market for this. But I could, because I was self-publishing these tiny little books for very little money and selling them at markets, and I knew people enjoyed them. So,
just on that, so you've obviously talked a little bit about your punk rock background, really, and it also seems to be there's an entrepreneurial spirit. There's almost like a not a gonzo spirit, but just sort of like a not guerrilla marketing either, but just a sort of like do it, wrap it, sell it, and get on the ground to sort of see what the response is.
Yeah, well, that's punk rock, because it said we don't need a record company.
Yeah, no middleman.
No middleman. We'll go direct. We made cassettes. We would put them in the shops ourselves. We'd make the posters. We'd organise a launch. So, we were just having a ball without any of the nonsense of whether this is a career or anyone owing a record company money.
Yeah.
It's just, you just do it yourself. And that's the whole purpose of it.
Was it sorry.
Well, then I just applied that to books. So I don't need a publisher.
Yeah. Was that pretty kind of at that stage in like the 90s? Was there a lot of that happening with children's publishing?
Probably very little, but the zine scene, what I was doing it didn't even have a name at that point, but it was the early zine scene where you can just make your own things, find an audience, and that's you are an illustrator or a writer.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful training ground, because you're seeing the effect of your stuff. If you're sitting in a market like I was, creative market, you'd see people pick up the books and laugh at them or frown at them, And that was telling me, again, the funny books were the ones that they would buy for $1 or $2 sometimes.
So how did this kind of inform you when you had to start dealing with, publishers, bigger institutions that are now helping you get your work out there as you move along, where I imagine there would have been a little more layers, more people, a little more resistance potentially to some of the really authentic voice and direction of the creative and your ideas for kids?
Well, I understood, number one, that they are a business and it's going to cost them money to make this book, and it's a gamble. Will they get their money back? So how can I help the publisher ensure that they get their money back? And Terry had already agreed to come on board with anything that I did. So that was a big part of calming the first publisher down, going, well, it's got the great Terry Denton, so we won't lose all our money on this crazy young kid.
And what had he done by that point?
He'd won a Children's Book of the Year for a picture book. So he was much loved and far more established than I was.
Yeah.
And he enjoyed illustrating my stuff because I let him go to sort of more anarchistic, crazy places than the other material he was being offered.
Yeah.
And that was the other big part of what I wanted to do, was to fire up the next generation with modern literature that reflected The Simpsons, The Young Ones, Monty Python style humour, that I didn't feel was being reflected in the written books. Subsequently, they were not reading them. So I just went, no, we just need to update. So to answer your question, which I've forgotten, I was looking after the publishers. And also the other crucial part of being a writer for children is that you are writing for three audiences. Yourself, you want to be totally involved and proud of what you're doing. The kids, you want them to be equally excited by it, but you have to go through the gatekeepers, which are the publishers, the adults, the parents, the booksellers. And adults very often have a whole different idea of what a book should be. They've got sophisticated literary tastes. They don't want the kids just wasting their time on rubbish. They want them reading proper books, but there is stepping stones, and you need pleasure and books that are just there for the pure pleasure of reading to even get to that next level of sophistication.
Yeah, so, there's a place for all of it.
And I had that growing up. I had the Dr. Seuss picture books, the Enid Blyton books. I'd resolutely steer away from anything that looked worthy or instructional. Reach for the horror comics on the newspaper stands. And so I was raised on lowbrow, highbrow, middlebrow.
Yeah,
I made no distinction. You'll see the books today are a sort of hybrid graphic novel. Lots of pictures, but also plenty of words.
Just on this as well, you've kind of described your work as child-centered fiction. Explain what you mean by that.
I'm trying to recreate the world as it appears to a child. And the world is often confusing and full of adults laying down arbitrary rules and things going wrong, and not everything is lovely and wonderful. There's jealousies with your friends. There's fears of what's hiding under the bed or other things going on. So that's why in my books I didn't shy away from the darkness. Books like Just Shocking, just disgusting, just reveled in the dark side of, it's often with a comic effect, and the laughter helps leaven the horror and the disgust.
Mm.
So you can go to interesting places if you're giving the reader a bit of a safety valve. But I just wanted to. It's not what the adult wants. I want what you want as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And my characters are often childlike in their singular fixation on something. Might be chips. Andy. My alter ego, Andy, in the Treehouse series has a high-security chip storage facility surrounded by laser beams and mouse traps and a 10-ton weight hanging over it. So if anyone tries to steal his chips, they're gonna die. So that's ridiculous because he's taken it to way exaggerated extremes. But the truth there is that a bag of chips is a very precious object to a child.
Yeah, that's how a child probably feels.
Yeah, that's how I felt. Someone steals my chips, and that's what happens. He comes to his storage facility, the safe's open, someone has stolen his chips, and he blames Terry, and they have an intergalactic space battle, which ends with Andy shoving Terry into a black hole and
justified.
Yeah, and then Jill coming along. Going, what have you done to Terry? And I said, well, I shoved him in the black. That's terrible. He stole my chip. And Jill says, it wasn't him who stole your chips. It was me. And I didn't steal them. I borrowed them. So
perfect.
You have blow-ups, and kids often say they love when me and Terry and or Jill are fighting in the books. They go, that's just like my brothers or my friends. We have these blow-ups, but we still go on, so you don't need perfect social relationships. And I was reacting against this idea that childhood should be a perfect experience. The adults are all very highly strung. We've got to make everything just right. And I think that you're doing the child a disservice by that, because even if you were to succeed, when they become 18 and get out into the world themselves, the world's going to slap them down. So things aren't going to go right.
Yeah.
And I think children's literature, good children's literature, prepares them just with a little bit of darkness and a little bit of, things didn't go so well there.
Yeah.
So I think that it's an important psychological safety valve to read stories where everything's not perfect. The characters may or may not resolve it, but they're probably going to give it a red hot go.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, the feedback that I get is the laughter.
Yeah.
Is so important, not for preparing you for anything, but for just letting you enjoy this moment as a child.
Yeah. Well, on that, I mean, really, like, how did you figure out what kids find funny? Because that seems like probably for most adults, it's probably quite a mystery.
Well, this is going to shock you, but I was a child for the first 12 years
There we go,
of my
breaking
life.
news banner. Andy Griffiths was a child.
And perhaps the difference, and Morris Gleitzman, I owe for this insight, he thinks with children's writers the window stays open at a certain age, a certain level of development. You're not arrested at that age. Mine would be around 9 or 10. Everything's possible. The world is just a playground, and things are exciting and new, and you're experiencing a lot of stuff for the first time, and it's exciting. That period before the hormones kick in and you start overthinking or deep
What
thinking.
a golden period.
Yeah. Now that's some writers like Morris and John Marsden specialise in that part. But Terry and I would always be revelling in the pre-adolescent thing. And that was the effect. That's what I wanted to celebrate. So that would tell me if is that feeling coming through the prose. Yeah. And interesting enough, it's really great for parents to re-experience that too, because as you grow up, your to-do list becomes longer, things get a little more serious. We're often we go too far down that track, and we go, oh, what am I doing? Why am I getting so worried about this little thing? And a good comedian, a good laugh can throw you back into perspective. So laughter is important for all of us at any age.
And how do you find the line? Because I think with your books, it seems that parents and adults can enjoy them just as much as kids sometimes. But how do you kind of thread that needle so that it's funny or there's something to laugh at or appreciate for both?
Well, number one, I start with the kid. That's my primary clientele is the child. And I just go, if I was 9 years old, would this passage or this idea amuse me? It's answering your previous question. So I just go look through the window and I see myself going, nah, that's too safe or boring. Oh, yeah, I like that. A room full of exploding eyeballs? Yes, I don't understand it, and neither does my adult self. Why would anyone want a room full of exploding eyeballs? But you ask that to a bunch of kids. They go, because they're cool. And, of course, nobody's eyeballs are actually exploding, so we can entertain this chaotic idea. So I'm negotiating between the children, my adult self. Will this upset parents or teachers, which I had to learn through hard experience.
Right.
Because Terry and I have had, 25 years to experiment with all sorts of humour. The Just series was fairly out there, a lot of gratuitous violence and gratuitous.
Did a lot get cut from that before it was kind of like the published versions that we know today?
Not too much. I'd done a lot of my research by that stage, but we did a book called The Bad Book, which did go too far. That's where Terry and I were learning to create in the same room at the same time together. And some of that humour just went a bit too far.
Right.
Where if an innocent victim suffers, like a dog, a cat got set on fire by a little psychopath, horrible child. But people were really upset because the kid didn't suffer enough.
Yeah, right.
So I went back and
balance.
Yeah, there's a sort of moral equation. If someone does something horrible in a story, they should ultimately pay a price. Otherwise, we're left kind of something's wrong with that story. I don't know what, but
yeah, interesting. So you had to kind of bang it around over the years and break some rules you ddidn't even know existed.
I had that kid set fire to himself, and then everyone went, "Fair call,
fantastic."
Idiot.
Yeah, yeah.
You suffer. You do it. You suffer. And it was clear that this was not an admirable thing to do. So just trial and error. We learnt, and with the Treehouse series, we really stumbled into it by accident. We just had a perfect blend of chaos, which was probably if the Just series is 80% kind of edgy, Treehouse is maybe 20% edgy, and it's got a friendship between the characters, which gives the reader a safe place to be. The treehouse also is a safe place, even though it's the most dangerous treehouse in the world. But there's a house and there's a set of relationships, and then you can have the chaos, and it all feels in the right proportion for what's turned out to be millions of readers around the world, not just a few hardcore kids in suburban Australia.
Yeah. That's cool. So you've got like a home base, a stable environment, and then once that's established, anything around it can happen.
And in musical terms, again, you can have hardcore thrash punk, which is, appealing to a certain type of person, but not everyone.
Yeah.
But when you bring a bit of melody and you use that energy,
it's like a gateway.
Your audience grows.
Yeah. You've used more and more illustrations in your books over the years. Obviously, your relationship with Terry is so fundamental to how your writing and publishing career has grown. But you're using more these days compared to when you started. Is that like a conscious decision based on what you've learned over the years?
Yeah, I think it was realising that many kids were enjoying the Just books through audio books.
All right.
And also through having them read to them by teachers.
Yeah.
But that the difficulty level of the words was actually quite difficult for them, because as an emerging reader, words are hard work. That you just listen to a kid learning to read. The cat sat. You're working. And I did write a phonetic reader many years ago just for fun called The Cat on the Mat is Flat, because it gets chased by a rat. Oh no, it chases a rat, and then the rat goes and gets a baseball bat and the rat chases the cat. And bringing that little level of silliness in and the simplicity with big pictures made that a very accessible text. And I was like, how could I apply that to longer narratives? And eventually the Treehouse, I realised I could say, hey, this is me and my friend Terry, and we live in a treehouse, and it's not any treehouse, it's 13 stories. Check it out. And I'd just say to Terry, can you just draw a 13-story treehouse full of inappropriate things like shark tanks and bowling alleys? And then the kid just inhales it instantly, and they've only had to read, hi, I'm Andy, this is Terry, we live in a treehouse, and they're inside the book. So,
and did Terry come up with the 13 levels, or was that you, or is that
I came up with 3. I said I want a really dangerous treehouse, bowling alley, shark tank, and a marshmallow machine that fires marshmallows whenever we're hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you design kind of this cool, dangerous treehouse? And then he did the 13 platforms in a tree with catapults and bedrooms. And that's the essence of a good collaboration.
Yeah.
He gives me what I want, but not in the way I expect. And then I went, oh my goodness, this is what the book should be called. 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 13 levels here, the 13-story treehouse.
Yeah.
And we'll be in it. And our big problem will be we can't write our book because there's too much distraction going on in all the different levels.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that was true life. We were stuck at a deadline and we didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
So I said, well, let's write a book. Let's write a book about not being able to write the book. And
But I like let's write a book. He's not just an illustrator, and you're not just you're true collaborators, and you influence each other on the entire story.
Yeah, that was very much where I wanted to go after the Just series, because that was written separate. Yep. I would work on the stories, he'd do the marginal stuff. But I was just like, there's more here. If we could do it together, there'd be an X factor that would be like a nuclear bomb for the imagination. And we have Jill, my wife and first editor, who is also an essential part of the team, reacting to everything that we're doing in real time. And she's read many thousands more books than I've ever read. And she has an inbuilt instinct for is the story progressing or have we got waylaid with a funny idea but losing all the drama.
Yeah.
So she's absolutely crucial to that process too.
Yeah, keep you folks in order a little bit.
And now Terry has retired, but the new young Bill on the block who's slotted into the same sort of method that we use. So it's very difficult to tell who's come up with an idea. Or you can come up with a raw idea, but then someone puts the icing on it.
Yeah, that you didn't even see.
You didn't even see. It was funny enough, but with this icing now it's compelling.
Yeah. Terry, Andy and Jill, characters in many of your books. Was that a conscious thing from the beginning to have kids sort of versions of you and your friends in them?
It was something that was in me right from the beginning, that I always needed to write the story as if it was happening to me.
Yeah, right.
The most outlandish thing, did I ever tell you about the day my bum detached itself? I was in bed. I woke up. It was standing on the window ledge, and I was like, "Come back!" But it was too late. It already jumped out. So now I'm like, "Oh, great! Now I've got to go find my bum, but my legs aren't attached. How am I going to do this?" So I'm narrating.
So I was trying to work out whether you're actually telling me this story as you now.
Perfect. That's what I want. I want the reader to not quite know.
Yeah.
They know because the events are outlandish, but I'm saying it so reasonably and begrudgingly rather than.
And realistically, so out of, you've attached emotion to it as if like you're remembering it rather than telling me a story.
So that way I convince myself that this is happening even though I know it didn't and it's not.
It didn't, everyone, just again.
Bums confirming. Can be embarrassing and they have their own agenda. They can release gas, they can release noise, and children get into trouble for that.
They do.
This is not appropriate. And it's like, it's not me, this is my bottom. And so this is part of the challenge of childhood is fitting in with the adults. And I took that idea that it seems like sometimes parts of your body are independent of you and said, what if they really were? And what would happen next? It always felt natural to me. And I'm going to contradict myself because The Day My Bum Went Psycho is told by Zach Freeman. It's one of the few books I've done in a third person.
Right.
But everything else, Andy, is all through the Just books.
And it sounds like even the way you generally write the story comes from a place as if it
as if it's really happening
to you.
And the kids knew Terry was the illustrator for the Just series and they knew he would tease me in the margins and they'd show me, they'd go, hey, do you know he's drawn a picture of you getting squashed by a piano? And I go, really? And they go, yeah, look, page 56 of Just Stupid. And I was like, right, when I get home, I'm going to smash him with the piano. And I go, do you live together? And I go, yes, he's so annoying. He's always smashing me with pianos and I'm sick of it.
So obviously the kids must feel like they know Andy Griffiths.
Absolutely.
They know Terry, they know Jill.
Yeah, so by the time we got to the Treehouse, I said, this is our life, writing the books that you like. And this is what I go through. This is what I have to put up with Terry. He's never doing his work. And one famous incident, he washes his underpants in the shark tank and the sharks eat his underpants. And then we called Jill because she lives in a house full of animals on the other side of the forest because she always wanted to talk to animals when she was a child. So I said, I'm going to give you your dream. You live in you know all about animals. And we call Jill, who comes and fixes the problem of the sharks by diving into the tank and doing open shark surgery on them. So she's fixing their imaginary problem the same way she fixes our real life narrative problems.
Yeah.
And Terry is always apparently wandering off topic, but the random things he comes up with are just pure grist for my imagination mill. And so you need those energies. Yeah.
Yeah. What an amazing collaboration. Why is it so important for kids to have access to books and stories?
Number one, to grow their imagination, because the more imaginative you are, the more you can apply those skills to every aspect of your life. You give yourself options. And also by reading, you are picking up knowledge of how the world works, or in my case, how the world doesn't work. Or you're reading from different points of view. So you're getting a more nuanced understanding of the world just by simply reading books. You're growing your imagination and you're also improving your reading skills. So your literacy is naturally getting better. You can write that job application letter so much more convincingly.
Which for some does take a lot of imagination to
absolutely
fill out.
Yeah. So literacy makes a big difference in people's lives, and I'm passionate about that as a side product of having a really great time with books. And I also meet kids and families who are in crisis or have been in crisis or have been through a pandemic, and they tell me how important the books were in being a bonding agent for the family, something where they could escape whatever they're going through, or the intrepid parents who drive around Australia. I can't tell you how many people have said, your audiobooks saved us sanity. They kept the kids quiet for those long stretches.
Yeah.
And we all enjoyed them. So I'm reminding parents of their childhood, which is a pleasurable experience mostly. The kids are just enjoying having someone who understands what it's like to be a kid. So it's sort of win-win for everybody.
Yeah.
And in every respect.
You're a lifetime ambassador for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work there?
Yeah, it's a publishing industry initiative that started in around 2006 to get books into remote Indigenous communities where often the libraries would be destroyed by floods or there was just very few books in the communities. And many of those kids knew 2 or 3 languages, Indigenous languages, but their first encounter with the printed word would be the first day of school.
Wow.
Which is pretty late. It is really great to expose and immerse kids in literature right from the womb. Plenty of research to show they're picking up the rhythms of language just from you reading them before they're even born, but certainly after they're born, to have books as a regular thing, to know which way the pages turn, to know that you can read them over and over again. It's a pleasurable bonding experience between you and the child, so that books and reading are sort of natural part. We figured books, you cannot learn to read if there are no books. And in some ways, Indigenous people in these communities are very good readers of their landscape. They're far more literate than me or you in those areas.
Yeah.
But they also have to deal with the outside world, and not having literacy is a disadvantage. It started with little sort of exploratory trips with a small group of us, and I would talk to the kids and make little books with them and show them how they can turn their amazing lives into these little 9-page narratives. Floods, close encounters with crocodiles, snakes, wonderful family trips, trips where the kids are just out by themselves, fishing and building fires and eating them. And I was like, you kids are living the dream. And so that's grown into a whole publishing program, plus where 150 such books have been created with different communities where the kids can see their own lives reflected back in the books.
Well, yeah, like how important is that for those communities for those kids to see themselves in this kind of writing?
Well, it's all important, just as I recognised my own sense of humour in books I was reading. We love seeing films from our movies when we can recognise the places. It just gives us that extra bit of connection. So having them be able to see these are all the things we eat in our community is, these books are talking to me. And in their case, I had a hand in creating it. So literature becomes less alien and more something, a way of interacting with the world.
Yeah. You mentioned it briefly there, family road trips, how kids often experience the books in some ways, audiobooks, obviously, a massive thing these days.
Yep.
what's your opinion of them, and how have you had to adapt some of your books to that format?
Yes, all of our books have been made into audiobooks. Poor old Stig Weems read most of them, and he would, because some of them were highly visual, so he would improvise.
How do you do that? Yeah,
he would improvise and bring a comedic talent to making it all work. So that was really great. But I'm happy for kids to interact with imaginative stories in whatever format is available and what works. So reading, arguably storytelling began as an oral thing because literacy is only a 200 or 300-year-old invention for the masses. So many people would have just heard stories, and this is where I would connect back to music. Literature is a form of song, songs being an early way of telling stories too. But there's a rhythm, there's a sort of musicality to language, which Jill and I are very sensitive to as we're revising the books. Does it sound good? That's really important because that's what's going to make it sing in the reader's imagination. Audiobooks, ebooks, if that's going to work for you, then do that. Paper books still retain a huge popularity because you can sort of stop and go backwards and reread, and you can mark the pages.
Yeah.
You can with an ebook too, but it's less it's not quite as easy. Audiobooks, movies have their place. Plays, we've had many plays made from our books. And a good experience with any of those things can send you back to the printed page.
Yeah.
Or the printed page can leap off into these other places. So it's all a sort of virtuous circle. But I do see books, print books and theatre are much closer because they're sort of a very direct engagement, a conversation with the audience that you are saying, let's play make-believe. Okay, we're in this theatre. We know the characters are not actually the characters, but we're going to, you pretend and we'll do our best to make this real. And you enter into that shared space of creativity. And I think with a book also, just black marks on a page.
Yeah.
I've got to trick you into believing this.
You suspend your disbelief. You fill in the gaps.
And there's a lot of rewards for that. A movie has decided what the characters look like. They've decided how this is going to go. It's got to work in an hour and a half. We haven't got weeks to just weave in and out of a book and go digressing here and there. So bam, bam, bam. So that's less of an imaginative experience than a book. That's a terrible thing to say. Movies are very important to me, but books are a particular pleasure and a very close one that once you bond with a book, it's with you for life.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of movies that would be that for me too, but they're fewer. Book is where I've had close interaction with that author.
And it's a singular version, probably, your version of that book in your head.
I've made it all up to suit myself.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what would your advice to parents be on, putting together a media diet for a kid these days? Where do books sort of fit into that?
I'd look for a balance between books, between television, between movement outside, between time away from the screens. I think a parent can regulate that, and it's too much of anything is not good. I've learnt that sadly by the age of 64. I've always been a fan of excess, but with kids, they're not maybe necessarily going to have book reading as their top priority in a life, because it does take a little bit of effort, the ability to sit in a place and concentrate. And And even as adults, adults very much are busy doing stuff, and it's hard to find that time. One thing I love to do myself, if I want to read a big book, is I get the audio book as well as the print book.
Yeah, I do that as well.
I listen to swathes of it while I'm in the car.
Yeah.
And then I get home and I go, where am I? Read a few chapters. So I have that pleasurable reading thing, which I love. But then I'm not taking 3 months to read the book.
Yeah.
I'm moving along in the car, and I find it a seamless experience.
It's great to hear that an actual author does the same thing as I do as well. We're in the sort of last part of the questions here. What do you wish that people talked about more when it comes to literacy and young people?
What do I wish they talked about more? Good question.
Maybe it's a terrible question. Maybe there's no answer to that one.
I'm always looking for the child-centered text. So is this appealing to me as an adult, or is it going to really excite a kid?
Yeah.
That's my acid test.
Is it really going to be engaging?
Yeah. Or can it engage everybody at the same time? So, I still think books have an enormously important part to play in developing literacy, giving kids a safe haven and a really enjoyable playground. So anything we can do to keep that alive, to keep our libraries as a vital part of any school. I find it incomprehensible that some schools are going, we don't really need a library anymore, or a qualified librarian who's keeping ahead of or who knows about what's available and can connect the right kid with the right book, or just show them what's out there. Because you just don't know that stuff. So, I think that's what we should be talking about. Every school should have a library and an enthusiastic qualified librarian. That would be nice.
Any tips for engaging reluctant readers these days?
Well, I'm doing my best to write books that entice them in, and there is, of course, many more books available now than there were when I was growing up, and also even 25 years ago. There are many great books that are taking sometimes an irreverent approach or an exciting approach, blending the pictures and the words and creating a landscape where each reader can find the type of thing that turns them on. Because each reader is different. Even though many kids enjoy laughing, some kids want something non-fiction and serious, and we have to look after them as well. Otherwise, they'll just go, reading's not for me.
And any tips for educators, parents, people that are trying to kind of foster a love of reading?
Obviously expose your child in whatever venues, whether it's a bookshop or a library, regular trips to the library. Tolerance for what type of books they want to read. It may not be the great childhood book that you had. Sorry, but time moves on, and even Enid Blyton, as much as I loved her, there's a few cracks, and it needs updating, as does Roald Dahl. What was okay 50 years ago is not necessarily what we'd want today. And I know I'll get a lot of people upset there because we must have Roald Dahl as he did it. But there's modern versions of all of this. And be tolerant of your child's tastes. They may not be yours. But where you can find shared interests, make it a family thing. Yeah.
Final quick fire questions. What's a book that changed your life?
Ooh, so many of them. It was probably Cole's funny picture book. Professor Cole, E.W. Cole, Edward Cole, was a bookseller around the late 1800s, turn of the century, and he founded the world-famous Cole's Book Arcade, which is where Dimmock's bookstore is now in Burke Street.
Uh-huh.
You can still see parts of the arcade there, but he believed reading was going to be the saviour of mankind. The more we can educate people, the more we can appreciate other people's points of view, the more we can think more interesting philosophical thoughts. It was, that's how we progress. And he made his bookshops places where people could come. They didn't have to buy. There were couches. They could just sit and read. And he had them full of exotica, monkeys and parrots and sort of circus performers.
Wow.
It's really extraordinary. And he believed passionately that to introduce a child to reading, you needed to make it a pleasurable experience. So he made these little pamphlets just full of funny pictures and little poems and things that he just collected. And they became Cole's Funny Picture Book, number 1 and number 2. And they were vast compilations of Victoriana. And suddenly utterly terrifying and inappropriate and awful, but always funny, always with the intention of enticing a child in. And they worked so well for me. You could never exhaust these books. There was always something to wonder at or to be disturbed by or to come back over and over. And his nephew eventually did number 3, and it showed Professor Cole riding in his submarine, collecting images and ideas for his books. So that went in very deep for me.
Wow.
I'm going to be in my own books.
Yeah.
Write books that will create pleasure for children. So
There you go, Professor Cole. Yeah, nice one. What's the funniest feedback that you've ever received from a young reader?
From a young reader, it was probably turning away from the signing table saying, "Mum, I thought he was a kid, but he's like an old man," which was a great compliment. They believed I was their age and their friend. And I still am their friend, but I'm just not their age.
Must be quite the shock. What about from a publisher? I feel like you were this close to giving me something, some funny tidbit.
My favourite negative review is of The Day My Butt Went Psycho. It was from an Amazon review, and someone said, "If the works of Shakespeare could be typed by an infinite amount of monkeys in an infinite amount of time, this book could surely have been written by one monkey with one typewriter in a couple of hours."
Wow.
And I went, respect. That is brilliant.
That review gets a good review from Andy Griffiths himself. What's next for you? What's on the boil?
Well, we finished the Treehouse series after 13 years, 13 books. It takes a year to write each book. Terry is taking a long and well-earned rest, and I've started a series with Bill Hope called the You and Me series, and it's written in response to all the readers who wrote to us and said, "Can you put me in the book? Or family? Can you put our family in the book? Can you write a story with us in it?" And I was like, how would I do that? Wouldn't it be fun if I just assumed the reader was my friend and a fellow adventurer, and we'd been on a lot of adventures together? And I go, "Hey, do you remember that time we were down the bottom of the ocean and we fought a high voltage electropus? And what about the time we climbed Mount Quakerlot on roller skates? That was cool." And so with that tone, and I put us both, or with Bill's help, put us both in adventure suits, full body adventure suits, gloves, face, a cardboard box helmet. And that was also to make the reader able to relate, no matter who they are, what nationality, what gender, what age, so that we're completely kind of mysterious characters. And we go on, and I recount the adventure that you've forgotten. In the first time, it was the time we went to the land of lost things. And in the most recent book, when we jumped down a hole and discovered the terrifying peanut butter beast at the bottom of the hole. And so that's been a lot of fun, just playing with that idea of identity, of who's telling the story and who you are as a reader.
Yeah.
And that we're both inhabiting a shared imaginative space. And
an amazing device to bring the audience with you as well.
Yeah, well, it just felt natural, and I was answering their desire to be in the story with me without having a cast of millions. Yeah.
And finally, if you could give one message to every kid picking a book for the first time, what would it be?
Make it an Andy Griffiths book. No.
All right, thanks everyone. That's Andy Griffiths.
One piece of advice, I don't know. What do you think? Do you like it?
Yeah.
And if they go, then I'd say put it down immediately, find something else.
There you go. Wise words to end on. Well, Andy Griffiths, thank you so much for joining us today on Stories of Wonder.
My pleasure. It's been an honour. Thank you.